Hey everyone, this is Dylan Taggart here for another 360 Insights HR Tech Chat. I'm here with Ray Walker. Ray is a contingent workforce compliance expert and he's based in the UK. Hey Ray, thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Dylan. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah. Uh, just so everyone knows, Ray is always making sure people are staying in compliance and making sure businesses stay in compliance with their contingent workforce. I guess the first question right off the bat for you, Ray, is how would you best describe a contingent worker? Because I feel like it may not be a term everyone's familiar with.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. As you go around into different countries, you come across a lot of different terms with regards to it. So it's good to sort of clarify. Contingent worker is often called a non-standard employee. In the UK, it's getting known as an off-payroll. It effectively is someone who you're not engaging on a full-time traditional employed basis. They can work on single gigs. They might be working on programs or projects that are sort of lasting a little bit longer than that, and they may come back for repeat business on a number of occasions. So it's quite a wide spectrum of what they might be, but those who are not permanent employees of your workforce.
Interesting. And you mentioned project-based, and I think everyone kind of is becoming more familiar now with like the fractional or gig economy or contingent work economy. For someone like you who's really steeped in it, what would you say is kind of the landscape in 2024 for contingent work?
I think we're in a I think we're in a really interesting time. There's been a fairly decent growth over the last 10 years of contingent work. Around about one fifth of the workforce is now contingent workers. As I say, that's grown quite substantially over the last 10 years. Where we sit now, post pandemic, there's a lot more people who are sort of starting to work remotely. And from that, they've then sort of started to see the benefits of perhaps going and having either a side hustle or having turning their sort of like becoming a full time contractor or freelancer or gig worker, whichever term you want to go with. Um, so where we see it now is we see a market that's growing, moving in a really big direction, but we also see the legal landscape is still trying to catch up, and there's a battle there between making sure that things are being managed in accordance with either the different tax departments or the labour laws or even sort of immigration and cross border that needs to be brought into consideration because things are becoming a lot more global. So it's a very interesting market to be in. There's a lot sort of new entrants into it. There's a lot of new situations and technologies are continuing to evolve and come in and sort of try and help and push this even more. So yeah, having been in for this for a long time, I see the future being probably the most exciting it's ever been.
Interesting. And where do you fit into all of that? Like, how would you best describe your role to someone and kind of what your day to day or week to week looks like?
Yeah, sure. So I effectively make sure that everybody sticks within the rules, and the rules is a really big term, but it applies to the circumstance of that environment. So if I'm working directly with an enterprise client who's a user of contingent workers, the rules might be a case of making sure that they're not misclassifying the worker as either an employee or an independent contractor. They might also be considering about if they're trying to work with someone overseas, how do they make sure they engage them in the correct way? Are we talking about length of time? If I'm looking and working with the actual workers themselves, again, how many gigs are they doing? How many sort of projects? How long are their projects? Are they what's their intention? Are they saying I'm quite happy to be an employee? We don't need to look at the independent contractor part. That takes away challenges around misclassification. But working as an employee in that arena, you've got the employment rights side of that, and then obviously the correct taxes and deductions that need to be taken. And if you're multi-jurisdictional, which which jurisdiction has a claim on those? Is it some? Is it all? Is it just one part of it? So my part is to literally first and foremost to understand the rules of the environment, understand the requirement, and then go and apply those and make sure that there's process and procedure around it to make sure that we haven't overstepped anything. There are times then where I might be working with clients who will say, I know the rules, but I don't necessarily fit as a business inside those rules at the present time. What do we need to do to adjust? How do we need to get to fit within those rules? And it's trying to work and guide and push people in the right direction as to what they need to do. Sometimes it's not possible, and that's a big understanding because people want to necessarily sometimes work with people and you can't work in the way that they want to. But at the very least, I can turn the light on and show them what they need to do. And then it's up to them as to whether they can or want to actually make any changes. Often I come across this, that the clients that I work with, their clients have got requirements. And so whilst my client might want to sort of make those changes, they can't because of the requirements that their clients actually putting upon them as well. So again, it's understanding all of that sort of like how all of the dominoes are falling and how they're connecting all that together and putting that within the actual practice of the rules at that point in time for that specific set of scenarios. Quite complicated, but you know, as I say, that's probably in a nutshell. That's what I need to do: take something that's complicated and put it into sensible, easy speech, so that people can understand it and work with it.
Yeah, that can be a massive task. It's definitely in the U.S. and maybe and I'd like to shed some light on how it is in the UK. In the U.S., often there's the issue of like federal, state, city, or I guess you could say jurisdictional compliance you have to deal with within the federal system of the U.S. Is it similar there where you have to kind of balance all those simultaneously as well, and then I guess post Brexit, maybe you don't have to deal with the EU legislation anymore, but you may also have workers coming in from other countries in Europe as well. They have to factor in all that compliance, I'm assuming.
So it's similar and then distinctly different. So we don't have the multi-jurisdictional elements in the UK because you've just got one government. And in fact, you only have one government agency. So in the US, you've got multiple government agencies. As you say, it might be from a city perspective, a state perspective, or a federal perspective. So from an administrative perspective, it's a lot easier in the UK. However, that doesn't mean that they've solved all of the problems in how to sort of like work out where the landscape is. There's I think, a special status that I think I've only come across in the UK, where if we look at the US and the UK as an equivalent, the US has an independent contractor and everybody else is an employee. What you have in the UK is they have like a middle ground of you have your independent contractors, you have your employees, and then you have what's been termed in a number of different ways. Some have called them a dependent contractor, but their legal term is that of a worker. And that's someone who's effectively employed, but on a contract basis and working at a site and working for a client who isn't their employer. So they're being seconded out all the time, but on sort of like a short-term project. That has a different legal status, and people get different rights according to what their status may be. So we have to be conscious of that. We have to be aware of that. There's changes afoot in the UK political landscape, and one of the things that they're looking at is that actual classification and the rights that workers get, to whether they get day one rights or whether they're getting, in some cases, they don't get these rights and some rights until they're 2 years into an event. And so that means contractors never get them because they're not going to be a contractor. They're not going to be in a contingent space if they're doing something for more than 2 years. So we have to look at that. If you look at them post-Brexit, there are changes, but not massive sweeping changes. Before Brexit, you still had to look at check to ensure somebody had the right to work. You now have to do that, but the right to work has taken on a slightly different face. So now it's if you've got a British passport or if you've got the freedom of movement before Brexit, so if you've got a European passport. And there's certain things the government put in place to help sort of like work out whether you've got that in play. And then after that, anybody else is effectively, it's a no. They need to be turning up with some kind of work permit. So it's not, as I say, the landscape isn't massively different. It's just possibly the library of passports that you could have looked at is narrowed down to sort of like either a passport an EU sort of share code, as they call it.
Thing. And I know you, because just for everyone's full disclosure, Ray and I have spoken before, and in our previous talk, you did mention that misclassification of work is a big issue, and people are usually very close to being out of compliance. But you also mentioned that part of the reason is that the law has just not really caught up to the landscape of work. Um, could you give me could you give us a bit of an example of what that would kind of look like in your day to day and how and when where the law is kind of lagging behind?
Yeah, I think that UK is a really good example. As I said, there's three classifications of different types of workers. You have the traditional employees, the independent, self-employed ones, and then the legal worker. That's something that's really has been in place for a few years now, but that was when contingent workers were of a real fraction of the actual workforce. As I say, they're actually more than 1/5 of the UK workforce now. So it's taken on a lot of people who are sitting within that and now caught up into this. So when it was not really having a big impact, then perhaps people didn't really care too much. It didn't have such a voice. But now it's got a bigger voice within because people are looking at saying, well, I'm not getting the rights I should do. There's actually a status within the UK where you can be employed for tax purposes, but at the same time not employed for employment rights purposes. So you pay the same employment taxes as you would if you were as an employee, but you have no rights whatsoever. And it's a great example of showing how it's misaligned with what people expect or want. We all believe, if we're an employee, the biggest benefit about being an employee is the protections you get around that, whether that's employment rights or whether that's actual employment benefits or whatever it may be, you're getting some kind of add-on. And we understand and we expect if we're going to go self-employed, we want to be an independent contractor, that's fine. We're probably going to earn more money because that's, again, why that works that way. You're going to get your unit price is going to go up. But you're understanding you've got to look after yourself. You're going to pay what you need to pay for health insurance and any of those sorts of things. You hit that middle ground in the UK, you're suddenly getting the same sort of money as what you get if you was employed, but with zero rights. And that's where the legislation has to catch up. That's where things have got to speed up. If I flip that and take that into the US, the misclassification risk there comes again down to employment rights because the Department of Labor and what have you, the IRS is obviously looking at it from a tax perspective, but the Department of Labor is looking at it and going, we need to make sure that everybody's being paid the correct rate of pay. We don't want people to be sort of underpaid. We want to make sure they're getting overtime and also all of those sorts of statutory benefits. But there's a lot of people that are now working in the independent contractor space and doing it out of choice. They're doing it. They might be working in sort of the lower value, low earning ones as a side hustle. They might be working in something that's a bit more, they've turned their sort of full-time job into an independent contractor role. But they want to take this on and they're happy and want to be an independent contractor. But sometimes that choice is taken out of their hands because the different government agents come in and go, well, we actually think the way you're engaging, you should be a W-2 employee. And you're going, again, it needs to sort of catch up into there should be, in my opinion, I think you've got two different types of independent contractors. And I think there should be a different way of handling each one. The first one is what I will term the professional services contractor. They're the one who's, they're earning a fairly high level of money. They're highly educated, is highly skilled, and they have no issues with regards to the rights or the remuneration being put against them because they know if there's any challenges to what they're doing, they'll walk away from that current assignment and find another one quite quickly. Those ones I don't think need protection. Those are the ones that are currently caught up in a protection, but stifles their actual opportunities because of being caught in that. If we flip it and go to the more transactional sort of your Uber, your Lyft, and those type of workers, I firmly believe they need protections and they need to be looked after. And those are the ones, again, that it's less of a highly skilled task that you're bringing in. That's where we need to make sure the legislation's in the right place. Because we've always had traditional employed or self-employed, legislation's been designed to support those two. It's not had this middle ground part of the, well, what if you're personally choosing to be self-employed, but working on that sort of spectrum of either professional services or low value gig? That's where legislation's got to catch up. That's where it needs to work out what it does. For me, if I had the perfect world, you'd have two definitions of contingent workers, one sitting in the professional services, and whether you put that as a value, like literally a day rate that they were earning, and anything above that puts them into that, is to be determined. But if you ran with that, you then legislate for the ones that need the protections down the bottom end, allowing then for the entrepreneurial spirit of the professional services ones to go on and thrive and actually generate a lot more business.
And do you think the digital landscape has made it harder or easier in this sense? Because there are way more ways to make money, not just, in person, doing a project in person in your town, in your city, or whatever, what have you, within an hour from you. It's now possible to sit at home, work for someone in a different country or across the country, um, while simultaneously maybe after that you go do a job locally in person. Um, how do you feel like the digital landscape made it harder or easier for someone like you to stay in compliance? Because obviously the checks and balances have increased because there's a bit more of like a paper trail, like a digital paper trail. But has it complicated things more in the sense that the sources of information or sources of data coming to you is now just doubled or tripled?
Yeah, the digital age is definitely the fire underneath this, and turned it from being a much smaller thing to what it is today. And it'll only get bigger because of that, because so many people have got an opportunity to earn money from this. My son told me a short while ago. He's obviously based in the UK. He's actually earned money from a gaming site, so he's actually had to complete a W-8 Ben, which is a US tax form, so that he can actually get paid from a company in the US because of him going onto one of these platforms and actually designing something. And it just shows you, that's a 19-year-old boy, or man, sorry, really, but who's gone and tripped an overseas tax regime because of a digital platform that he's working on. So the digital side of things has changed everything. It's made it now possible. What does that mean from a reporting perspective? As you say, there's a paper trail there. So it's a lot easier now to audit and check and find things. But the challenge is, because now the audience involved in it is so much larger, it's actually harder now to necessarily find the individuals within there. So your chance of being found is a lot slimmer. But once you're found and the audit trails on it, it's going to be quite comprehensive. Now, the reason why I mention that is you're not trying to hide anything. But when if you're being from a compliance perspective and you're working with people, it's not uncommon for me to get oh, yeah, but there must be a workaround. There must be a way of, we can handle it this way or that way. So you get a lot more challenges than perhaps there used to be against what you'd say and what you do. And because then you're looking at so many different jurisdictions at times, your awareness or your knowledge of what's going on and what you might trip and what you might do has to become broader. So yeah, it's definitely made it more challenging. Um, I'm a bit of a crazy person. I find that fun. So for me, it's quite interesting. I'm having to learn about lots of different locations and how they operate and how that might influence and interact with whoever I'm servicing at that point in time. But yeah, it's not going to get any easier. There's no way it's going to get any easier. The part now is down to, as I say, the people writing the laws and what have you, trying to catch up to that, to sort of try and control it in the right way.
And do you think potentially one method of controlling it could be kind of moving towards what you mentioned in one of our previous conversations, the common reporting standards that they have in the EU? Could that be
Yeah,
something that obviously it's going to be impossible to get the entire world on the same page by next week? But let's say moving forward, countries that maybe interact with each other more, like Europe, like not Europe, obviously Europe isn't a country, but the EU, the UK, and let's say Canada and or all of North America, you could say. Is it do you think do you maybe envision a world where all of those are kind of on a common reporting standards like they have in Europe, or is that the most efficient way, or not so much?
Yeah. So if I had a bit of detail for anybody on here, the common reporting standards, actually, I checked this. There's now over 125 countries worldwide who signed up to the common reporting standards. And that's all effectively around the financial services, making sure if people have got entities or businesses overseas, they can then those countries can report to one another, and they tie in. And they actually came from the US original version, which is FATCA, and that came in again. It's from financial services, and the common report standards came after that. But that's a great example of showing 125 countries who have signed up, who are now saying we're going to basically build our financial services industry on a common standard so that we can transfer that information. And we agree, we come together and we report that information around to one another. So it shows that things can align, but it's then a question of what you want to align on that. So immigration is something that people are never going to align to. They'll always run to their own immigration. The requirements of people wanting to go to the US, for instance, is always going to be, the demand's going to be much greater higher than the supply. Whereas if you go into, even in countries in Europe, you can go into like Greece, the demand is much lower than the supply. So even an EU country itself is sort of like a vast differences. So they're never going to align on immigration. But if it comes around to then the how you control that, if you've got somebody working in one site place and taxes being paid in another, how you do that, because that's just business transactions. That's not necessarily being seen through the bank. That's where an advancement of the common reporting standards or FATCA can actually step up to actually improve that. And it's shown that it can happen. Those are definitely the advances that are needed on a global scale to try and simplify the audit trail. Because the audit trail is there, it's just difficult to find. If you've got something that's more aligned on more countries, then you can make it easier. So it's not sort of, I mean, you go into Australia and you work on something in Australia, and it's absolutely nothing like you've seen in the US or Europe. In the way that they run their business, the terms, the systems that they're using, nothing at all like it. And that's, if you can unify some of those things around the world, you can definitely make it easier.
Yeah, it would make it all a lot more seamless, which kind of leads me to my next question is, obviously this change in work didn't just happen overnight. It kind of began in, 20, 30 years ago. To say we started shifting more towards this type of work. Do you think this is potentially the natural evolution of work for people, like full-time work in the sense where you work for one big company or a company, um, and that's who you work for? Obviously, that's already changed in just our life, or not our lifetime, but in the last 100 years, like from our grandparents to us, or I'm sure the next generations. We're no longer staying at a company for 30, 40, or your entire career. It's very rare these days. To the point where now we're at the point where maybe you stay at a company for a couple of years, or maybe you never work for a company full time ever. Do you think the natural evolution of this is going to be a world where no one really has traditional full time jobs anymore? And do you think that essentially the policy is going to have to adjust, or like just financial institutions and in tracking mechanisms are going to have to adjust to just accept that that is the new norm in the West at the very least. And I'm
Yeah,
sure outside of the West it might be different, but it does seem like it's an unstoppable trend.
I think you're right. I think it is an unstoppable trend. And if you take it back, and if you go to the Industrial Revolution, is what dragged everybody into the same workplace. Your Monday to Friday working for the same employer happened then because it all got centralized. You're now going through the technology revolution where it's all being decentralized, and people can work in whichever location as long as they've got access to power and as long as they've got some kind of internet. And Elon Musk has solved that problem for us. Then you can go and work from anywhere. So, and people, as you say, it's really interesting to talk to people who are just starting off their careers And they've very much got that mindset of, I don't necessarily want to work for anybody. I don't want to be beholden to an employer. And there's the ability to do that now. They've got that ability to go and work for who they want, when they want, however they want. And the 9 to 5, it's not dead. I'm not trying to say that, but I think it'd be very interesting to see where we are 20 years from now, because there's a big challenge as to how much of the workforce is doing, the 9 to 5 anymore, and how much are doing, their own sort of ways of doing it. As I say, we're over 1/5 of the workforce is contingent in the contingent space now. There's an expectation that will double by 2050. I think is sort of the times that they're throwing at that. So that's making big changes. So it's gonna happen. It's an unstoppable force. The only question is how long it takes to happen, and then the journey that you go on to get there as well, and how you then make sure that, again, from a compliance perspective, I think there's going to be a lot of elements associated to it. I regularly speak to clients who are saying, we've got workers who are now based in X, Y, and Z country. We've got to engage with them. Tell me how we solve the problem. It's not about, it's now we have to solve the problem. It's not an option not to solve the problem. They need those workers because of what they've got. And it just shows that the power is definitely moving towards the worker more than it was once on the employer. So I think it's a very interesting time we're in.
Hmm. Yeah, and on that, employee employer kind of dynamic that is going to exist within all these changes. Previously, in our previous talk, you had mentioned that reducing a permanent workforce for a company, let's say by 50%, could make them look more efficient, which was kind of a smoke and mirrors move a little bit, because they ended up hiring a lot of contingent or part-time workers or just contract workers. How did companies kind of handle this from kind of just operating costs, operating expenses? How should they look to the future to handle all this? And then simultaneously, for the person entering the workforce or the person that's been in the workforce for a really long time and doesn't really know how to handle all this, what kind of advice would you give to those two parties?
Yeah, I mean, as to how to handle this, I spoke to someone recently who set up a company, and they've got, I think, 3 permanent employees, and the other 300 or 400 workers they're working for are on the bench. They literally tap into them whenever their clients want, and that's their business model. And they've just taken some really good funding from somebody who likes that, and they can turn the tap on and off according to what they want. So those type of business models are already there. That's where it's already settled. If you're looking at how does a company best embrace the contingent space, or what's the best ones for it, they have to change. They can't go and be the business that it was so many years ago, be that 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. They can't be that same business. If they want to embrace and take on the contingent revolution, they've got to sit back and go, okay, we've got to treat these like they're independent of our business. They can't work with them as their employees and have all of those old historic controls. If they don't, and the companies that thrive in that have changed or will change. The companies that don't thrive and struggle are the ones that go, no, we want to be in control of this. That's ultimately what they're saying. They've said it in various different guises, but they want to be in control of everything. So as I say, that's the best thing you can get from anybody on this. If you want to go and embrace it, you've got to change. You've got to come up with something different. It's definitely here to stay, in my opinion. It's just whether you want to be part of that. If you're somebody who's worked, I think new workers can embrace this a lot easier than somebody who's perhaps got, a couple of decades worth of traditional working experience. The new workers, it's new to them. This is like, yeah, this is what I want to do. And it's quite aligned with their psyche. There's someone who's already been sort of working for an employer, that might be multiple employers, but is used to doing that employer-employee relationship. Jumping away from that is a new thing that they've got to adapt to. But it means, again, the change there is breaking away from the 9 to 5. The plus point about working 9 to 5, and I struggle to find anyone who works 9 to 5, but if we use it as a concept at least, it means you've got a start date, a start time, and a finish time. When you start working in the contingent side of things, there is no real defined start and finish time. But that means that you can also spend whatever time you want during the day doing whatever you want to do. But you might be sitting under a desk lamp at 11 o'clock at night finishing off a project that you've got to do. So you've got to get used to that side of things. It's not a defined start and defined end. It's now just random and whatever suits your lifestyle. But that's probably one of the things that's really appealing to people who want to go into that lifestyle, because it allows them, and COVID showed a lot of this. You can live your life without having to go and commute for many miles and many hours, and you can carry on doing your work. You can do whatever it is that your family demands put upon you, and you can still do your job. And yeah, you may well be working at 8 o'clock at night, but that's after you've sort of done everything you need to do with your kids and they're settled down, and you're sort of like in the right space. So the probably the key to all of this, to embrace the future, to adapt and go into the future, don't try to use the models that's been used in the past. There's got to be a change in models.
That's a great way to put it. To embrace the future, don't try to use the models of the past. And, speaking of embracing the future, have you had interaction with some companies or systems or vendors that are really kind of at the tip of the spear, are really grasping these changes well, and that you've worked with and that really handle these kind of compliance issues or contingent workforce issues well?
Yeah, apart from the one that I just said, which I think is amazing, 3 permanent employees, the rest are just, contingents. The other good example I come across is a client that we addressed, and they were, we've got people who we must have in the contingent side of things. They've got to be self-employed. Tell us what we need to do. We'll adapt, we'll change, we'll do what's needed. And that's exactly what we was able to do. So we was able to tell them what they needed to adapt and change. But what we also did is then put it into context for them, because a lot of people often look at this as a one size fits all. And I don't think the workforce of today in any company is now a one size fits all. You've got traditional employees that will stay traditional. You've got contractors who need to be employed because of the way you want to engage with them. And then you've got workers who can be self-employed, the independent contractors. What you have to do is to partition your workforce, in my mind, before you go and put any strategic changes. Partition the workforce and work out the ones that are going to sit in which camps. So you're then only addressing, if you're looking at making change to your business to bring on the independent contractor element, you're only looking at a portion of the business, not all of it. And you're not then making big changes for everything, which is difficult to do, but will carry perhaps a level of risk you don't need to carry. And if you're trying to take that internally as a program and trying to get some internal adoption onto that, if you say to them it's actually only, say, 25% of the business, not 100%, it becomes a lot easier for internal adoption to happen in doing that. So again, it's that same thing. Look and plan and understand and work out what is relevant and what's out of scope. Because if it's out of scope, great, leave it as it is. There's no changes. Everybody's happy with that. Nobody wants any sort of new changes to go into business. It's easy to do. But if you need to adopt and bring on stuff, then you've got it into scope and you've got it at a scale that's perhaps more manageable than it was before.
Interesting. All of some very great points. And Ray, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a great discussion. And yeah, I know while the future of work for some people, even for myself, who like kind of was told growing up this is kind of how work works, the landscape ahead can be a little scary, but it's I liked the idea that it does give you a lot of freedom, and I think a lot of people appreciate that, and that work is has changing definitions, and thank you so much
Yeah.
for the insights on how to handle it. And if anyone wants to reach out to you for if they have any questions and if they want to reach to you directly, what's the best way for them to do that?
Best way to find me on LinkedIn, which is I'm under the handle of Ray C. Walker, I think you find if you look on LinkedIn, so it's nice and easy to find. If you can't, you can always use my work email address, which is a nice, easy one, which is ray@worksum.com.
Awesome. Well, Ray, thank you again, and it's been great speaking with you.